Hello everyone, my name is Dan and I make Warhammer 40k content that no one asked for. And today we're going to be talking about how to balance a game of 40k between two unevenly matched people. The average player is not a tournament grinder. The average player goes every few weeks to a local game store or maybe to their friend's garage. They play a few games with the same people and they do that on repeat. And that's okay, but one of the issues that comes with that is that sometimes you will have people who will win a lot more and some people who will lose a lot more. And that can be kind of unfun if you go into games kind of expecting to lose or already at a significant disadvantage. Moreover, if you are trying to get better at the game and even train for a tournament, it can actually be kind of bad training if all you do is automatically win every single game you play with your local group of friends. So what we're going to be doing today is talking about how we can get better practice and have more fun with our group of friends. But first, I want to share with you a quick story. So I used to play chess with my dad a lot. In fact, he was the one who taught me how to play. And of course, as you can imagine, when I was a kid, he was much, much better than me. And so what my dad would do is he would start the game of chess, but he would take off a piece so that I would be playing essentially up on points to start. So at first he would take off the queen, and then as I got better, he would take off, a rook, and then a knight, and then eventually there was no pieces taken off. And that was his method of trying to get me to learn chess better by essentially starting with a handicap. But that was actually not a very good way to learn how to play chess. As you can imagine, it taught me that all I had to do was trade my pieces one for one, and then by the end of the game, I was up an insurmountable advantage. Additionally, it caused me to learn different positions that would never actually happen in a game of chess. And so what I would like to point out first is that there are certain ways that we can try to give ourselves a handicap or help a different player that actually hurts them in the long run. So one thing we're going to focus on today is make sure that the tactics we're using here to even out the playing field don't reinforce bad habits or teach you to play a certain way that is not the right way to play at a tournament. So I'm going to be using a couple different terms, and I want to make sure we straighten those out at the beginning here. One of them is going to be advantaged player, and the other one is going to be disadvantaged player. And the idea is that there are a variety of factors that would go into having one player have a much higher percent win chance against a different player. And those specifics aren't super important, but we're just going to call it there's a advantage player who generally wins most of the games, and a disadvantaged player who loses most of the games. So what we're going to be trying to do is kind of take down that advantaged player a little bit and bring up that disadvantaged player through a few different means. So my first tip, and something that I think is incredibly important, is not letting any gotchas get the disadvantaged player. Many new players may not know how your army works or will fall prey to basic things like forgetting about heroic intervention or forgetting about specific stratagems or maybe accidentally taking a model off an objective when they shouldn't. And we're going to kind of lump these into gotchas that come from a lack of knowledge. In a game of practice between friends, we should never let that disadvantaged player be gotcha'd. And this goes back to the idea of bad training and practice. You'd never want to have to rely on your army tricking your opponent in order to win. That doesn't mean you should never use your cool stratagems or do heroic interventions, but it means that you should make your opponent aware of the trade-off they're taking when they do something in the game. Because when you go to a tournament, the person across from you will actually probably know how your army works. And if you're hoping to actually win that grand tournament or major, hoping that your opponent has never played against your army is a bad strategy. Now, when the tournament comes, of course, take advantage of it. But if we're trying to practice and get better, essentially what you should do is practice for the best and then beat the rest. Now, there is a fine line here between playing for your opponent and giving them tips on how to kind of go against you. So it's very important that you never dictate what your opponent has to do, but rather just let them know, hey, if you move there, I'll heroically intervene on you. Are you sure you want to do that? Don't make the game unfun for them because you're pointing everything out and, forcing them to play a specific way. Give them that agency, but you do want to make them aware if you think that they're making a very large tactical blunder or simply forgot one of your rules. Tip number 2, and this is, I think, an issue that a lot of newer players have when they first get into the game, is that they tend to be pretty bad at picking secondaries. And I've talked about this numerous times in some of my other videos where I say you should pick your secondaries and then design your army around those secondaries, but most people still go with making the army they want to play and then picking secondaries after they've made their army. But most new players tend to be pretty bad at picking secondaries. I know I was one of them and I still make those mistakes. For example, let's say you're playing against my Thousand Sons and you're trying to decide, do I want to pick Assassinate, do I want to pick Abhor the Witch, or do I want to pick Take No Prisoners? Now those could all be 3 valid options, but you only choose one out of those 3 options and you're just not sure what to do and you're racking your brain about what to pick. What I recommend you do is just take a few extra secondaries and then drop the lowest scores at the end of the game. This goes back to what we talked about in point 1, where we don't want to be getting our opponent because they made a massive blunder. If you're hoping your opponent just picks a terrible secondary and that's how you're going to beat them, that's not a good way to practice winning games. So if you're that disadvantaged player, try to take a couple of those extra secondaries and then calculate what the score would be at the end of the game. Maybe you get through all 5 rounds and you look and you say, wow, Assassinate would have gotten me 6 points if I picked it. Abhor the Witch, 8, but Take No Prisoners would have been 10. So let's pretend I had taken Take No Prisoners and see how that point stacks up. This will also give you a better idea on how secondaries work and kind of seeing how the points actually end up at the end of a game. Ultimately, we're all here trying to get better, and sometimes you have to just play with the secondary to realize it's either good or not good. If you guys have been keeping up with Warhammer community, you've probably seen a bunch of the new Eldar models. Personally, my favorite is the Persian-speaking Eldar. It's called the Farseer. If you like that joke and other type of ones like that, you can feel free to support me on my Patreon. All of my videos are able to be made because of them. They help me buy this new camera and this new setup and the new mic. So thank you so much to all my supporters. The third tip for balancing out a game between friends is to really focus on the terrain. Now, it's really important here that we stay within the realm of realism. There are very specific types of terrains and terrain setups that you see at tournament games. So if you're not playing one of those, something like a WTC terrain layout or an LVO terrain layout or a Games Workshop terrain layout, I recommend you try to go to one of those. However, if you don't have the capability to replicate those terrain setups, or you go to local tournaments that do kind of just randomly strewn across terrain, what I suggest you do is try to give terrain that favors that disadvantaged player. So generally, the more line of sight blocking terrain you have, the better that is for melee armies because they kind of have safe spots they can leapfrog to get to a ranged army. Of course, it isn't perfect because there are some armies like Tau that have an ability to ignore lots of line of sight blocking terrain. However, generally that's true. Additionally, if you have ruins with windows on the first floor, that generally tends to favor shooting armies as opposed to ruins with no windows, which favors melee armies. If the disadvantaged player has knights, playing on the Games Workshop terrain might make it really hard for them to actually move around in. One of the takeaways is that you want to give the advantaged player kind of the worst case scenario with terrain. So keep it within the realm of realism and what you could see at a tournament, but what would be kind of like the worst terrain layout that they could reasonably play on. Tip number 4 is letting the disadvantaged player choose both the mission and who gets to go first or second. It seems like in the new missions, going second is preferable to going first, but of course every army will play slightly differently into that. So what I recommend is you let the disadvantaged player choose whether or not they want to go first or second, as well as the type of mission they want to play on. Some missions start 24 inches apart and some start closer to 18 inches. Different armies that have lots of pre-game moves or are very aggressive really like those 18-inch kind of dead man zones between the two armies. Let the disadvantaged player choose one of those missions, or the advantaged player can say, hey, I have a really hard time on this mission. I think you do better on this one. It's important to know that the disadvantaged player is disadvantaged and has a lower win percentage for a variety of reasons. It could be that his or her army is simply less powerful, but it could be that they're not as tactically sound and they don't know what the right play or the right thing for their army is. And so they should take advice a little bit from the advantaged player in terms of what gives the advantaged player the biggest problem. So it's not always just the choice of the lower win percentage player, because they may not always know what's good or bad for them, but rather what gives them the best chance of winning. And sometimes that's a conversation between the disadvantaged and the advantaged player. My fifth and final tip is to allow for liberal proxying. We all know that Warhammer 40k is an expensive game, and I have tried to make videos about how to make it cheaper before. But at the end of the day, not everyone has the ability to play any type of army within their own actual faction. And we know that some factions have a very strong, very specific army that works off a variety of synergies. And if you only have half of those pieces, you're going to do a lot worse. Now, it's cool if that disadvantaged player just wants to play with whatever models they have and whatever's painted. Like, once again, this game is all about having fun. But if you're trying to practice, I do think there is some value in practicing with tournament lists or practicing with the best lists possible. So if you are that advantaged player, let the other player take whatever army they want and kind of liberally proxy and do counts as to get a more competitive army. I think it's important to go back to the idea of bad practice here. What you don't want to do as a disadvantaged player is tailor your army. You still want to take a take-all-comers list that you would bring to a tournament. If you know that your opponent is going to play knights and all you do is take meltas, well, that might help you beat the player, but it's not going to teach you how to actually go in and win against an Eldar army. So proxy some models, do a bunch of counts as, play the most competitive list you can, but don't tailor it to your opponent to your own detriment.